War is hell. It reaches every hand, from the soldier in the trench to the nurse at his side, from the engineer forging weapons to the families left behind. These are their stories. This is World War I Stories, Tales Beyond the Trenches. Today's episode, Stars Beyond the Sea. He had never seen a lighthouse before. Well, he had, just not from this close. From his days as a merchant seaman, he always saw them as just a beacon of light warning ships that land was nearby in the darkness. Now, he stood beneath one, looking up at the tall structure that stood watch over the waters surrounding the peninsula. Einar Bjornsson was 37, and as he got older, his body was resisting the rigorous activities required of a merchant seaman. Now, he was embarking on something new. The door was easy to find. From afar it was a bright red, but as one got closer, you could see the weathering of the paint. To the left of the lighthouse sat a small cottage. This cottage looked to be connected to the large stone structure. Einar made his way to it, and even though he had been given a key, he knocked on the door. After a few moments, the door creaked open, and standing before him was a man more than a head taller than himself. Einar did not often have to look up to see a man's face, but he did so here. "Good morning. My name is Einar Bjornsson. I'm the new—" The man responded and began to open the door wider before he could even finish. "Lighthouse keeper, I know. I've been expecting you. Please, come in." Einar entered the small cottage. The single room was modest but comfortable. A stone fireplace occupied one end of the cottage with a small cast-iron stove nearby for cooking. A sturdy wooden table and two chairs stood beneath a window overlooking the sea, while a narrow bed rested against the opposite wall beside a simple wooden wardrobe. Shelves held a few books, lanterns, and neatly stacked supplies. Next to the bed was a plain wooden door that he assumed led to the hallway connecting the cottage to the lighthouse itself. "I'm Olafur Peterson," the man said as he extended his hand. After a brief introduction, Olafur began the tour of the facility. The living quarters had been self-explanatory, so he led Einar through the door and into the lighthouse itself. The ground floor of the structure was empty except for the red door that he had seen outside, and a spiral staircase that hugged the wall and rose upwards to the upper floors. The second and third floors were utilized for storage of various items such as oil, wicks, paint, cleaning supplies, and food. The smell of the rooms matched their usage. The fourth floor was the watchroom. This room had 3 windows facing the ocean and was equipped with a desk, a logbook, and a cabinet with spare lamp parts, weather instruments, a pair of binoculars, and even a small cot. At the very top was the lamp room. This room was encased in glass and held the lifeline to Icelandic shipping. "Why the cot when there's a cottage?" Einar had asked him at the time. "Sometimes I like to lay up here at night and look at the stars," Olafur replied. "That sounds relaxing." "I kid you, Einar, I kid you. When there's bad weather, especially high winds, I stay here to be closer to the lamp. Plus, it never hurts to be high above the waves when a squall hits." He looked at Einar and winked. "Trust me on that, my friend." Back in the cottage, the two men settled in for a light lunch of salted cod with rye bread. "What is the food situation like here?" Einar asked. "Supply boats come. They bring what we need. I fish a lot when the weather is good. I caught this cod this morning." He lifted his fork to admire the white, meaty fish that jiggled at the end of it. "How often do they come, the supply boats?" "It depends. Sometimes every month, sometimes every 2. Oliver took a drink and wiped his chin with his arm. "What made you take a job like this, Einar?" "Something new, I guess. Something more peaceful than being on a merchant ship all the time." Oliver smiled. "It's definitely peaceful up here, except, of course, when there's a storm. On nights when the sea is calm, I like to sit in the watchroom and look out over the water. Sometimes I swear the stars come down and rest upon the sea. They twinkle there for a while before climbing back into the heavens." Oliver was an interesting man, Einar thought to himself. "You sure those are stars and not boats?" Oliver chuckled and shook his head. "Oh, I'm sure. I know the difference between boats and stars." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting towards the window as though he were looking out across the harbor, even now. Spend enough years out here, and you'll see all sorts of things. The sea has a way of playing tricks on a man. Sometimes I think she's just reminding us that she has more secrets than we ever will. Einar smiled politely. He wasn't certain whether Olafur believed every word he said or simply enjoyed telling stories. Either way, there was no harm in it. Olafur stood and gathered the empty plates. Come, I'll show you my favorite fishing spot before I leave. You'll want to know where it is. Sounds good to me, Olafur. An hour later, after returning from a small cove nearby, Einar watched as Olafur began the 3-mile walk back to the harbor town of Klatavik on the far side of the deep bay. Einar's first month at the lighthouse had been relatively uneventful. He performed maintenance when needed and kept careful notes of what he observed in the harbor, mostly the comings and goings of ships. During his second week, he had been visited by the harbor master, a tall, portly man named John Sigurdsson. It was a friendly visit, although one where the man expressed his frustrations with his predecessor. Not only had Olafur never used a telegraph that had been installed, but he also never even told Einar of its existence. The old fool was so stuck in his ways he refused to even consider it, the man had said. Well, how would he get information to you? Notes? Einar asked. He would simply walk to town when the weather was good. And leave the lighthouse unattended? The man shrugged his shoulders in acceptance. He was always back in time to light the lamp, so I paid no mind, really. But it would have been nice to get some news sooner. Well, I used a telegraph on the merchant ship, although not often. John Sigurdsson slapped his hands on his knees in elation. Wonderful! That's great news. I do have a nephew. He has more energy than I ever had. I can always use him as a runner up here once a week also. Einar chuckled. That won't be necessary, sir. I can handle the telegraph. Sigurdsson stood from the wooden chair he had been sitting in. The chair let out a long, high-pitched creak as he did so. He walked to the window that looked out toward the rocky slope that led to the harbor. His expression had changed dramatically. Have you been keeping up with the war, Einar Bjornsson? Einar had not. Denmark was not participating in the hostilities, which meant that, by proxy, Iceland was not involved either. Not really, sir, just bits and pieces here and there. He watched as Sigurdsson turned back towards him. 2 months ago, Germany initiated unrestricted submarine warfare. He paused a moment. Normally I would not be concerned by such an action. They've done this before. Last year, I believe. I could be wrong. Earlier in the war, anyhow. Nothing to really be concerned over. The war is far from here, Einar added. The war was far from here. He put an emphasis on the word was, an emphasis that made the hairs on Einar's arms stand up. America has entered the fray. This revelation shocked Einar. What did he mean America entered the war? They were neutral, as was Denmark. When did this happen? Einar asked. Germany tried to convince Mexico to fight the Americans. The message found its way into American hands. I had not heard about any of this, Einar admitted. So what does that mean for us? Sigurdsson turned back towards the window. Germany has started sinking ships again. America has declared war. That means the Atlantic is about to become a very dangerous place. Since that day, Einar had taken to making a daily pilgrimage to town to fetch a newspaper. Sometimes I'd swear the stars come down and rest upon the sea. They twinkle there for a while before climbing back into the heavens. Those words ran through his head as he sat at his desk in the watchroom, light flickering from the oil lamp beside him. He had been writing in the ledger when something caught his eye, the twinkling stars in the distance seemingly resting on the water. 2 of them seemed to drift ever so slightly across the water before coming to rest again. After a time, they were simply gone. He wrote it down. 3 days later, he saw something similar. This time, there were 3 stars. 2 drifted slowly together before remaining motionless for nearly an hour. Again, he recorded the sighting in the ledger. Over the next week, he observed the stars resting upon the water 4 more times. Each occurrence was carefully entered into the ledger. This morning, he had tucked the ledger under his arm and made his way to town where he handed it to John in the harbor master's office. "If you don't mind, I'm going to go get a newspaper while you read that. I'll be back in 10 minutes. John, opening the ledger and flipping to the latest pages, looked up at him. "Sounds good." When Einar returned, John hadn't moved from the desk. The ledger lay open before him as he slowly turned another page, then another, before flipping back to the beginning of the entries. He read them again. "Find your newspaper?" John asked without looking up. "I did." John turned one more page. "Sit down." Something in John's voice told him this wasn't a request. Einar pulled out the chair and sat down. John continued leafing through the ledger as Einar sat in silent anticipation. "Is there something wrong?" Einar asked finally. John held up his hand to silence him and continued flipping back and forth between the pages. Finally, John looked up at Einar, turned the ledger around so he could read the page, and pointed to a passage about the stars on the water. "Do you know what you're seeing here?" For well over a month, Einar had lived in relative solitude in the lighthouse and its cottage. Now he had a roommate. John had been at the lighthouse 16 hours a day over the last 2 weeks, only leaving in the morning to tend to his tasks in the harbor master's office. The rest of his time was spent in the watchroom, binoculars raised to his eyes, watching, noting, waiting, especially after the sun went down. He had explained that what Einar was seeing, what Olafur had mistaken for stars resting upon the sea, were not stars at all. They were German U-boats meeting supply vessels under the cover of darkness. At least, that is what he believed. Tonight, Einar lay in the cot as John again sat at the desk. Einar watched as the man stared into the darkness, the only light in the room supplied by the small oil lamp flickering on the desk, and the occasional sliver of light filtering down from the slowly rotating lighthouse lamp in the room above. "There!" John said excitedly as he pointed towards the dark horizon. "Right there! Einar, come look!" Einar rose from the cot and picked up the spare pair of binoculars which had been sitting on the desk. He put them to his eyes and scanned the horizon. "What am I looking for?" Einar asked. "There are 2 sets of lights out there. They keep blinking off and on. I think that's 2 ships communicating in Morse code." Einar scanned the horizon until he found them. They must have been 15, maybe 20 miles out. "That looks like Morse code. I think they're signaling one another," Einar whispered as he watched the lights flicker on and off. "Can you read it?" John asked. "Not accurately, not from this distance," Einar answered. Then, lowering the binoculars from his eyes, he wondered aloud. "Why would they be signaling each other out in the open like this? It's careless and stupid." John had set his binoculars down also and was now writing in the ledger. "I don't know. Maybe the radios are down. Maybe they feel safe knowing that we're neutral." "Oh, that's a false sense of security on their part, then. I bet there are British ships out there seeing this very thing," Einar added. "Just in case, though, we need to report this to the district sheriff." John paused. "No. We'll telegraph the governor's office in Reykjavik. Let them send it on to Copenhagen." Over the next 15 minutes, the men worked together to write the message out. When they were finished, John watched as Einar tapped it over the wires. A few moments later, the machine on their end began to click. It was a short acknowledgement that the message had been received. 3 days later, a Danish patrol vessel appeared off the peninsula, spending hours slowly working the waters beyond the lighthouse. The next day, British patrol vessels were seen escorting merchant ships through the waters beyond the peninsula. Whether they had been sent because of the telegram or had already been operating there, neither man knew. The flurry of activity in the waterway had prompted John to not take notes in the ledger. "There has to be plenty of documentation going on already," John had explained. Einar had resisted this, arguing that they may see something the patrols did not. "Keep watching if you like, but the Navy has more eyes out there than we ever will," was John's counter. Einar still took notes. He felt obliged to. Eventually, John had decided that his presence daily at the lighthouse was no longer necessary. He had gone back to Kotavik. Now, alone again, Einar was spending his evenings and nights in the watchroom, watching and noting, waiting. But for what? He did not know. He watched as day after day the patrol ships dwindled. At first there had been 4, then 3, and now only 1. The Danish patrol had gone as well. The telegraph had remained silent. It was a warm morning in June as Einar readied himself to walk to town to get a newspaper. Maybe he would get breakfast there as well. But before he could leave, there was a light knock on the door. At the door was a boy about 8 years old wearing a pair of neatly pressed wool trousers and a newsboy-style cap. He held a newspaper. "I'm Bjorn. My Uncle John sent me to bring you this newspaper and to fetch you back to his office." The boy then held out the newspaper, which Einar took and lay on a nearby table. "Has something happened? Is your uncle okay?" Einar asked instinctively. "I don't know. He just asked me to bring you." Einar looked down at the small brown-haired boy and tried to force a smile. "Then let's get going, shall we?" John was sitting behind his small mahogany desk and began to speak the moment Einar entered the room. "They found nothing." Confused, Einar asked, "Who?" "The patrols. I received a letter from Copenhagen this morning. They appreciate our diligence in reporting the sightings off the coast of Klatavik, but after searching the area, they found nothing. No German ships, no supply vessels, nothing." Einar stood quietly for a moment, taking in the news. "So the waters are safe?" "According to them, yes." Einar let out a breath he had not realized he was holding and sat down in the chair across from John. "That's good news, then." "It is," John replied. Einar looked towards the windows. "But what did we see?" John leaned back in his chair. "Lights." "I know they were lights." "That's all we really know, Einar. We saw lights." Einar thought about that for a moment. "You said they were U-boats." "I said I believed they were U-boats," John corrected him. "There is a difference." "And the signaling?" "2 ships signaling one another, perhaps. Fishing vessels, merchant ships. Who knows? We could not read what they were saying." Einar nodded. That was true. John picked up the letter and looked at it again. "They searched for days. We saw the ships ourselves, 4 patrol vessels at one point, not to mention the British. If there were Germans sitting out there refueling submarines every few nights, you'd think someone would have found something." "You would think," Einar replied. John looked down at the letter for another moment before placing it back on the desk. "They know what they're doing." There was something in the way John said it that made Einar look at him. "You don't sound convinced." John smiled lightly. "I am a harbor master, Einar. Worrying is a part of my job. If I stopped worrying every time someone told me everything was fine, I would probably be out of work." Einar chuckled. "But yes," John continued, "I am relieved. We saw something we could not explain. We reported it. They investigated. They found nothing. I suppose that is the best answer we could have hoped for. Better than them finding a German submarine." John laughed. "Much better." Einar stood from the chair. "So what now?" "Now?" John leaned back and smiled. "You go back to keeping ships away from the rocks, and I go back to making sure they have somewhere to dock." Einar smiled. "I think I can manage that." He started towards the door before John called after him. "Einar." He turned. John hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Keep writing in that ledger." "I always do." John nodded. "Good." With that, Einar walked out into the cool afternoon air. The docks adjacent to the administration building were teeming with people as the steamer seemed to prepare for boarding. Taking a deep breath, he stopped to look at the people mulling about, waiting. He saw a little boy, one hand firmly holding his mother's while in the other arm he held a stuffed bear. He saw an older couple, probably in their 60s, talking quietly to each other as they admired the steamer and seemingly each other. "They found nothing," he said quietly to himself as a wave of comfort came over him. He continued to scan the crowd. His eyes stopped on the little boy again. He had released his mother's hand and was looking directly at him. The boy waved. He waved back and felt himself smile. The fish were not biting this evening. Then again, they rarely did. He had more success catching them in the wee hours of the morning when the waters were colder. But he felt relaxed and had wanted to sit by the sea and cast his line. The walk back from town earlier in the day gave him plenty of time to think, time to mull over what he had been told, and, more importantly, time to come to the realization that he and John had indeed been seeing things. One star on the horizon had melded into another, and then mingled with the reflection of the calm waters. There was no danger. Why would there be any danger in Iceland? In the distance, he could see the steamer he had seen earlier making its way out to sea. He watched it for a moment as it slowly grew smaller against the horizon. There was something comforting about seeing it out there. Just another ship carrying people from one place to another, exactly as ships had done long before the war began. Einar smiled and returned his attention to his fishing. Maybe John was right. Maybe they had simply spent too many nights staring into the darkness looking for something that was never there. After another 20 minutes, Einar finally gave up on the fish. He gathered his pole and made his way back towards the lighthouse. The sun was getting low, and it would not be long before the darkness settled over the water. He climbed the stairs to the lamp room and prepared the light for another night. Soon, the familiar beam began its slow rotation over the sea. Satisfied, he made his way back down to the cottage, where he prepared a simple supper of bread, potatoes, and what remained of the cod he had caught the previous morning. He ate alone at the small wooden table while reading the newspaper Bjorn had delivered earlier in the day. There was plenty about the war. There was always plenty about the war. When he finished eating, Einar cleaned his plate and made his way back into the lighthouse. He climbed the spiral staircase to the watchroom, where he checked the weather instruments and made a few notes in the ledger. The harbor was quiet. He sat at the desk and looked out over the water. The sky was clear and the stars had begun to appear overhead. His thoughts went to Oliver and his stars resting upon the sea. He wondered how many nights the old lighthouse keeper had sat in this very room staring through these same windows. A bright flash in the distance caught his attention. Einar sat forward and looked towards the horizon. For a few moments there was nothing. Then another flash appeared in the same area. What was that? He stood and picked up the binoculars from the desk. At first, he could see nothing but darkness, but as he slowly scanned the horizon, he found a small orange glow. It was a fire. Einar adjusted binoculars and continued to watch. The glow grew brighter until he could make out the dark outline of a ship. A few seconds later, another flash erupted near it, and after a short delay, the sound of the explosion reached the lighthouse. No. He lowered the binoculars for a moment before raising them again. It was the steamer he had watched leave Klatavik earlier in the evening. Einar dropped the binoculars onto the desk. He sat in front of the telegraph. He grabbed the key and began tapping out the message. Ship attacked off Klatavik. He paused for a moment. He did not know the name of the vessel, and he could only estimate how far offshore it was. He added the best location he could and sent the message. There was no response. Come on. He sent another message. Ship attacked. Fire visible from lighthouse. Send help. A short time later, the machine began clicking. Message received. Einar immediately returned to the window and raised his binoculars. By now, the fire had grown considerably. Flames illuminated the water around the steamer, and through the binoculars, Einar could see the ship beginning to list. There were people moving along the deck. Some appeared to be gathering near the lifeboats, while others seemed to be running from one end of the ship to the other. Einar lowered the binoculars. There was nothing he could do from here. He had sent the message, and now all he could do was watch. He raised the binoculars again and continued looking at the burning ship when something beyond it caught his attention. There was a small light in the distance, a star resting upon the sea. Einar stared at it until the light disappeared. A short time later, another appeared farther away before it too vanished in the darkness. He and John had been right. Einar turned his attention back to the steamer. It continued to list until the water reached the edge of its deck. The stern slowly began to rise, and he watched as the ship finally disappeared beneath the dark water. For a long time afterwards, Einar remained at the window. Eventually, other lights appeared in the distance. These were ships coming from Klatavik, and others farther out responding to his message. But by then, there was no longer a steamer for them to save. Einar sat down at the desk and opened the ledger. For several minutes, he stared at the empty page before dipping his pen into the ink. He wrote down the time of the first flash, the estimated location of the ship, the explosions, the fire, and the light he had seen beyond it. Everything. When he finished, he closed the ledger and leaned back in the chair. He was exhausted, but sleep would not come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the flashes in the distance and the burning steamer slowly disappearing beneath the water. They had been right. For weeks they had watched those strange lights. They had written down what they saw, reported it, and watched as patrol ships searched the waters around Klatavik. They found nothing. Einar stood from the desk and walked toward the window. A few rescue ships could still be seen in the distance, their lights slowly moving across the darkness. How could they have found nothing? He felt anger building inside him. Copenhagen had told them the waters were safe. John had believed them, and eventually Einar had as well. He had spent the walk home convincing himself that the lights were nothing more than stars reflecting off the water. He should have trusted what he had seen. But what difference would that have made? They had reported it. The patrols had come. What else could he and John have done? Einar returned to the desk and sat down. He tried to read, but found himself staring at the same page for several minutes before finally putting the newspaper aside. He fought sleep for as long as he could. Part of him felt that he needed to remain awake, to continue watching the water in case another ship appeared or another flash lit the horizon. Eventually, his eyes became too heavy. He moved to the cot and lay down, telling himself that he would only rest for a few minutes. When Einar opened his eyes again, sunlight was coming through the windows of the watchroom. He sat up and looked towards the sea. It was calm. Einar made his way downstairs and stepped outside without bothering with breakfast. The lighthouse towered behind him as he walked towards the edge of the peninsula. There was nothing where the steamer had disappeared the night before. No smoke, no fire, nothing to suggest that only hours earlier a ship had sunk beneath the water. A few rescue vessels could still be seen far in the distance, but otherwise the sea looked as it always had. Einar sat down on a large rock and stared out over the water. After a few minutes, something among the rocks below caught his attention. He stood and strained his eyes, trying to make out what it was. Something was moving in the shallow water. Einar began making his way down toward the shoreline, carefully stepping from one stone to another. As he drew closer, a tear began to sting the corner of his eye, although he did not yet understand why. He stopped. There, lying in the shallow water, being gently moved against the rocks and back out again, was a dirty, waterlogged, stuffed bear. You've been listening to World War I Stories, Tales Beyond the Trenches, where history comes alive through the lives of those who lived it. If this episode moved you, please share it, follow, and leave a rating. Help keep these stories alive. Want to hold these stories in your hand? Explore the books inspired by them, available now on Kindle and in paperback.